Thanks to everyone for joining today's virtual public meeting of Forging Ahead. First, the MBTA team has a presentation, and we ask you to please hold all comments until the end of the presentation. Second, we'd like to remind everyone that this meeting is being audio and visually recorded and will be made publicly available. Third, we have planned the meeting to go to 8 p.m. tonight with a hard stop at 8:30 for our interpreters. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone of a few meeting controls for folks who are not familiar with Zoom. Next slide, please. This meeting will include ASL interpreters. The meeting host will spotlight the interpreters to ensure that they can be seen at all times. The ASL interpreters expect to switch approximately every 20 minutes. There may be a minor delay in interpretation while interpreters are being switched. If at any point you cannot see the interpreter, please let tech support know using the chat. Next slide, please. We also have closed captions for this meeting. By default, subtitles should be appearing at the bottom of your screen. If you do not see the captions, please press the closed caption button to get them started. Next slide, please. If at any point during the meeting you have any technical questions about Zoom or the accessibility features of today's meeting, please chat tech support. Next slide, please. Following the presentation, we will first answer clarifying questions from the Q&A feature and then open the floor for comments and testimonials. If you have a clarifying question, please type it into the Q&A pod during or following the presentation. Due to time constraints, we may not be able to answer all clarifying questions tonight. All questions will be included as part of the meeting record. And if you have any questions on using the Zoom platform, you may use the chat feature to the MBTA tech support to help resolve any issues you may have. Next slide, please. On today's call, we're joined by MBTA Deputy General Manager Jeff Gonaville and FMCB Director Crystal Cornegay. I'd also like to acknowledge, we would like to acknowledge all the elected officials and staff that have joined us today, and we look forward to hearing from you all. Now I'd like to turn it over to Deputy General Manager Gonaville. Deputy General Manager.
Thank you, Angel. Good evening, everybody. I want to thank each of you for joining us here tonight. As Angel just said, I'm also joined by our control board member, Crystal Cornegay, but also multiple staff members to really help answer any questions that you may have. As a Deputy General Manager of the Authority, I really want to emphasize to everyone that we do not want to reduce service. The MBTA has been working hard over the last several years to improve and be better for our riders. We've expanded our ability to deliver capital improvements, consistently delivering over $1 billion of investment each year, resulting in tangible improvements in safety, efficiency, and reliability. The MBTA wants to continue improving as an agency so that we can serve the region better. The pandemic has significantly changed where and how people travel, resulting in a significant drop in ridership and fare revenue. A year ago, over 1.3 million trips were taken daily on the MBTA. Today, that number is 330. Even so, the MBTA is still running essentially the same service that we ran a year ago. That means that there are near empty trains, buses, boats, and vans out there today. Because of this, we are projecting a $575 million budget gap for fiscal year 22. We will present to you tonight a three-pronged approach to addressing this issue with internal efficiency changes, capital funding reallocation, and lastly, service cuts, which were our last resort. It's important to note that ridership did not decrease the same amount across the entire system. While there are commuter rail trains that are empty, there are bus lines at over 60% of their pre-COVID ridership. That means that those buses are at or above the COVID crowding standards we established for public safety earlier this year. Given the unequal changes in ridership and budgetary impacts that COVID-19 has had, the MBTA is undergoing this process to protect our essential services and the riders that depend on them. In this resource-constrained environment, it is the moral obligation for the MBTA to preserve the services that our transit-critical populations depend on. These are communities of color, low-income communities, and communities without access to cars. These are the groups that we're aiming to protect through this process. Without additional resources, the MBTA has no choice but to make difficult decisions. We are choosing to prioritize service to transit-critical populations, and that means hard conversations ahead. Today, we will provide you an overview of what we've identified as essential services. We will also propose a set of packages for where to add back service when resources are available.
Sure.
We are not proposing a fare increase. And I'll say that again, we are not proposing a fare increase. No changes in fares are being proposed at this time. If there were to be a fare increase in the future, it would have to go through a separate public process. The proposed service changes would not take effect immediately. Some of the changes to commuter rail service could take effect as early as January, and changes to the ferry should happen as early as March. Changes to the rapid transit system will be made in the spring, and changes to the buses in the summer. The FMCB is scheduled to vote on the changes on December 7th, so that planning can begin for making the changes in 2021. Most of the service changes are not intended to be permanent. We will bring back higher levels of service as and when ridership demands and travel patterns change, and there is durable revenue to support it. In some cases, particularly for non-essential bus routes and commuter rail, changes to pre-COVID service may be appropriate in order to reflect post-COVID changes in commuting and other travel patterns. We will restore service in response to ridership and in line with our planning to transform these services. One question we have heard a lot is, why wouldn't the T use more revenue like federal stimulus funds to stop service cuts if you can? Well, the MBTA is adjusting service in response to lower ridership and budgetary needs. The T is committed to providing essential service for riders who rely most on the T for reliable transit, including low-income people, people of color, seniors, people with disabilities, and people in zero and low-income households. The MBTA will, of course, make use of all available state and federal resources to ensure the continuation of such essential services. At the same time, non-essential services should be reduced to match current ridership until demand rebounds. Using limited resources to operate nearly empty trains, ferries, and buses is not a responsible use of the funding provided by riders, communities, and taxpayers, and does not help support the transportation needs of our region. Saving resources now by reducing underutilized non-essential services will help ensure the MBTA has the ability to bring back service in a sustainable and prudent manner in response to ridership demands after the pandemic has faded. So I just want to close with re-emphasizing how I began. We do not want to reduce service. And we really, truly appreciate each of you being here with us tonight. And I'm looking forward to answering a lot of the clarifying questions that each of you may have. Thank you. Angel?
Thank you, Deputy General Manager. And now I'd like to welcome Ben Schutzman, who is the Chief of Paratransit Services, to lead us through the presentation of the proposed service changes under our consideration. Ben?
Thank you, Angel. So today, as Angel and the Deputy General Manager indicated, I'll be walking everyone through this presentation. We're going to cover what Forging Ahead is, the process by which we've determined potential service changes, and then we'll be making sure to save plenty of time for questions and feedback at the end. So Forging Ahead is the process that the MBTA is using to help us understand how to best use our resources to meet the needs of our riders who depend on us the most. In order to do this, we're focusing on three key prongs of this strategy. First, we're evaluating all internal spending to see areas that we could potentially reduce it and generate savings. Second, we're identifying areas within our capital program where we can reallocate resources on a temporary basis in order to support our operating budget. And third, and truly last, this is, if all else fails, we are looking for a set of essential services that we will prioritize and run, and identifying other services that we will no longer be able to provide. We do believe that this is the right way to move forward to identify and provide services that are the most essential in a more equitable and efficient transit system. And by doing so, we believe that we will be able to help improve the economic recovery for all of Massachusetts. The MBTA is not alone in its struggles with ridership and reduced revenues. Many of our sister agencies across the entire United States are facing shortages of ridership and revenues as worse or worse than the MBTA is. The MTA within New York City is projecting losses of over $12.4 billion, and DC recently has come out projecting a deficit of over $500 million. In all cases, our sister agencies are going through very similar processes to what we are in identifying service cuts as a result of not having sufficient funds to continue to run all of the existing services. To help put things in perspective, we've shown a chart here which helps identify the total expenses for the MBTA and breaks it down into different categories. Overall, the operating expenses on a yearly basis are about $2.3 billion. Out of that, operating expenses are about $1.8 billion per year. You can see that the T spends a large portion of its existing revenues on wages, on services that we purchase, on the pension, and on our purchase services like Commuter Rail, the Ride, and Ferry. And when you put that in perspective to the potential budget deficit that we're expecting of nearly $600 million, that's almost 25% of our yearly expenditures. In order to help resolve this nearly $600 million budget gap that's projected for our next fiscal year, we're using that three-pronged approach that we've discussed so far, looking at internal savings, reprogramming capital resources, and then last but not least, looking at potential service changes and identifying areas where we can save within each of those categories. We currently are taking steps right now to try and build up reserves to reduce the level of spending cuts that would be required in the next fiscal year. It's particularly important to understand that if we lower our recommendations in any one of these categories, it would mean needing to raise our recommendations for spending cuts in any of the other categories, because ultimately we need to make up this budget gap. Next, I'll go over a slide which shows our ridership from the beginning of the pandemic and shows what has been a slow recovery of ridership. On this slide, you can see each one of our different modes that the MBTA runs from the beginning of the pandemic back in March all the way through October. On it, you can see a yellow line which represents bus, a silver line which represents the silver line. We've got colored lines which represent each one of our rapid transit lines, as well as a dotted black line for the Ride, a dotted blue line for Ferry, and a purple line for all of our Commuter Rail. What's particularly important to notice here is that not all modes have recovered equally. Even though what would have been almost a year ago, we were serving nearly 1.25 million trips on a daily basis, and the fact that we're only serving 330,000 of those on a daily basis today, not all modes have seen the same recoveries, with the Ride and bus and blue line seeing the highest recoveries to date, and Commuter Rail and Ferry seeing significantly lower recoveries. While we are still seeing, again, a significant reduction in the number of trips delivered every single day, we are still running essentially the same service that we ran prior to the pandemic. And yet we are still struggling. And ultimately what this means is that we are delivering many trips without riders on them. In helping us start to plan for what's next, we've done multiple different scenarios by mode to help us understand what a recovery would look like. We've put into place different scenarios which take into consideration travel patterns in terms of when customers may be back traveling during peak times and during off-peak times, whether they'll still be working from home. We've looked at vaccine timing as well as the overall economic recovery. In these cases, you can again see there will be a significant difference on a mode-by-mode basis in terms of when a recovery to pre-COVID levels of service will be. But it's important to understand that in none of these scenarios, even the most aggressive returns of ridership scenarios, do we see a return to pre-COVID levels in the next year and a half. So as we've talked about so far, forging ahead is about defining exactly what our core essential services will be and making sure that we invest in those services. Ultimately, this will be an iterative process where we've helped define our essential services to date. We're expecting feedback from you to help us understand how our proposals may be impacting you. And then as we go through the process, most of these service changes will not take place right away. While Commuter Rail may be changed as early as January, most of the changes that we'll discuss throughout this presentation do not happen until the spring or summer of 2021. Ultimately, as we add back service in an iterative way, it will be truly in response to ridership and demand. We'll be able to revisit our service levels on a semi-annual or quarterly basis, depending on mode, and make sure that, again, we're building back in the right way. So we've discussed to date essential services, and now I'm going to talk you through exactly what we mean by an essential service. The best way to do this is to walk you through this matrix here. On the top row of the matrix, we have highly transit critical populations and less transit critical populations. And what we mean by that is a high transit critical population represents lower income, 0 to low car households, communities of color, people with disabilities, and seniors. And then on the left side of the graph, we see higher ridership potential and lower ridership potential. And so by taking the intersection of these two concepts, we're able to define what is an essential service, which is in the top left quadrant of this, where we have highly transit critical populations with high ridership potential in the next fiscal year. Our essential services are considered to be the blue line, the orange line, the red line, the green line, the Mattapan line, nearly 80 of our bus routes, and the Fairmount Commuter Rail line. The goal of this framework ultimately is to preserve our services at or above the service delivery policy levels for our essential services. And the service delivery policy was identified and approved in 2017, and it's what helps us quantify what the MBTA's minimum acceptable levels of service by mode are across multiple different metrics. On this slide, it's helpful to understand where we are in this process. We kicked off the Forging Ahead process in early November at an initial FMCB meeting, and have been doing public engagement meetings just like this one since then. Our next step in the process will be a contingent vote on our potential service changes in a December 14th FMCB meeting. And then after that, we'll make sure that we'll be conducting a Title VI analysis and environmental review to ensure that our changes meet those standards. As discussed before, this will be a phase-in transition of the potential service changes, with Commuter Rail happening as early as January and again in May, Ferry happening as early as March, Rapid Transit starting in March and again making additional adjustments throughout the spring and summer, and bus occurring late June. It's also important to understand that the ride is impacted by ultimately mostly the bus changes, and so it will follow suit on a similar timing. It's also important to understand that although we are proposing these changes, they are not set in stone, and so we'll be able to go through our standard service planning processes that will occur at least twice a year and as many as 4 times a year to be able to adjust and make new schedules as ridership and demand return. For the next part of my presentation, I will go through in more detail each of the proposed service changes by mode. So we've talked through to date what an essential service is. And again, that's a high transit critical population with a high propensity to have ridership in our next fiscal year. And that represents about 82% of all fall 2020 trips that have been made to date. When we look at what our base service is, it will be the combination of our essential services, which we just defined, plus a reduced amount of our non-essential services. In this case, our base service represents the quality of service for all essential services, as well as reduced amounts of non-essential services that are still viable for many of those who depend on it. For many of our essential services, service may look similar to what it looked like in pre-COVID days. When we do have to make service reductions due to lower ridership, those service reductions are not expected to significantly increase crowding. Since we have our service planning process, we'll be able to watch these metrics and ensure that we are able to match our resources exactly to where the ridership needs it. In our base service proposal, all essential services will be at or above our service delivery policy with respect to our frequency, span, and crowding. And again, these essential services include our Fairmount line, all rapid transit, including the Mattapan line, our bus routes, which make up approximately 80% of the bus routes, and the ride service with smaller policy changes that we'll discuss later. As we reduce the level of our non-essential services based on their demand and alternatives, we're also focused on ensuring that we meet the needs that are available. So in this case, we'll be reducing peak service on all our commuter rail lines, which includes no weekend or evening service and reduced midday service. And we'll also be reducing the frequency on our remaining bus routes, including smaller service areas and consolidated routes. To help put things in perspective, our current weekday passenger trips that have been delivered, we're expecting, as I talked about before, 82% of our essential services will continue on our weekday trips. While on the flip side of it, only 3% of our current weekday trips will lack access or have to divert due to proposed changes to the routes. On the right side of this page, you can see a graph which indicates how all of our routes will be changing. In blue are all the routes that are at or above the frequency standards that we've currently discussed. In yellow are the proposed routes that will be below baseline levels of service. And red are the ones that have been proposed for elimination. Based on the weekly service hours that we were running pre-COVID, bus will be at 85% of those pre-COVID levels, rapid transit at 70% of pre-COVID levels, commuter rail being at 65%, and ferry would be at 0%. To help summarize what this looks like overall, prior to these changes, 82% of households in the MBTA service area had MBTA service within a half mile, versus after these changes are made, 78.5% will. For the Merrimack Valley region in particular, we have a bigger blown up graph here, which indicates exactly what was talked about on the past slide, which we'll get into in more detail. So again, this graph shows the routes that will be at or above their baseline frequency in blue. In yellow will be those that will be below their baseline levels of service. And in red will be the proposed eliminations. Here we have a list of all our essential bus routes that will be at or above our baseline standard. Of note, you'll see the Route 99 is in this service area and will be an essential bus route. For the Merrimack Valley, we have the following routes that will be changed either based on frequency, elimination, or consolidation. The Route 132, 134, 137, 350, and 354 are routes that will be possibly below their baseline. The routes 131, 136, 325, and 351 are proposed bus routes that would be eliminated, and the 354 and 352 are proposed route consolidations. On the commuter rail side, the Haverhill line in Lowell will be expected to again have no weekend service, no service after 9 p.m., and have reduced weekday service. And on the Haverhill line, the Cedar Park station has been proposed to be closed. Now I will go through in more detail both our ridership trends to date, as well as at a glance what the changes are on a mode-by-mode basis. For commuter rail, you can see a stark difference in the graph on the right, where the dotted line is a pre-COVID level worth of service, and the solid line is our current level of ridership that we've seen to date. There's been a significant drop-off both in peak service as well as non-peak service. To date, we're seeing about 13% of normal ridership, or about 16,000 daily riders. But during the AM peak, this actually only amounts to 8.5% of our normal ridership. So for the expected changes to commuter rail, again, to help summarize, we're expecting to stop all service after 9 p.m., but on the Fairmont line, that will be closer to 10 p.m. We're expecting to stop all services, with the Fairmont line being replaced by bus on the weekend. We're expecting to decrease our weekday peak service and some midday service to be ultimately reducing the number of trains out on a daily basis from 430 trains to from 505 trains. We're also expecting to close 6 out of the 141 stops based on lower ridership, operational impacts, and the availability of alternate modes of service. Specific service levels will be adjusted on a line-by-line basis to account for ridership patterns to be adjusted based on the fall 2020 schedules. Next, I'll preview a list of the potential station closures. And again, each one of these stations has lower ridership, and all but one are not accessible. These stations that are potentially to be closed are Plimptonville, Pride's Crossing, Silver Hill, Hastings, Plymouth, and Cedar Park in this specific region. You'll also note here that there are multiple alternatives available for each one of these commuter rail stops. Next, I'll switch on to the bus system. Currently, right now, we're seeing about 171,000 boardings on weekdays, which is 41% of our pre-COVID numbers. While not as drastic as commuter rail, you again can see a significant decrease in ridership both in peak and off-peak times. While this graph on the right shows that decrease, it is different when you look on a route-by-route basis, with some routes having service returned as high as 60% of ridership, and others being as low as 20% of pre-COVID ridership. An interesting note here on 2 cases. One, over 21 routes are being provided more service at this point than their pre-COVID levels to help prevent crowding. And these routes, for example, are the 22, 23, the 66, the 111, the 116 and 117, and 109. And this is important to consider based on our proposals, which I'll discuss in a second. We are seeing a significant decrease in the number of boardings after midnight, with all bus being just over 1,700 riders. Next, I'll go through the changes at a glance for the bus system overall. Similar to commuter rail, we would be expecting to cut off services, but in this case, services will be cut off after midnight, and there'll be no changes to the start of service or days of operation. We'll be reducing the frequency on all of our bus routes, but it will be different on routes that are considered essential versus those considered non-essential. For essential routes, we're considering an average 5% reduction system-wide, and on non-essential routes, we're seeing a 20% reduction on average system-wide. Again, these reductions will vary on a route-by-route basis, and in some cases, there will be no changes versus pre-COVID levels. All of these changes ultimately will be based on ridership. Out of the 169 MBTA bus routes, we're expecting to consolidate 14 routes, shorten 5 routes, and eliminate 25 routes. Of those 25 routes that are eliminated, 7 will be within a quarter mile of an alternate bus or rapid transit stop. So we judge that to be that these riders will not be stranded. 12 of those 25 routes serve non-transit critical populations with low ridership trips. And 6 routes serve high transit critical riders, but have very low ridership and have significant, but maybe not fully alternative modes to be able to go to. We're also proposing to eliminate the Suburban Subsidy Program, which partially funds 5 additional services, but these services have very low ridership on a weekly basis. For the ride, we're expecting to, as a result of these changes to the bus network, to have about 1% of our pre-COVID trips shifted from the ADA area to our premium area because there is no longer a comparable bus service nearby. There will be no changes overall to the geographic area, which means although the fare may be adjusted from ADA to premium, we will still service all trips, although the hours of operation may change based on where those trips occur. And so those are again guided by the bus hours, as we discussed, stopping after midnight, but not changing at the beginning of the day. And then the commuter rail lines for our outlying ride communities being adjusted for those last trains at the end of the night. All of our routes at the end of the day will continue to be reviewed for crowding and adjusted as a part of our quarterly service planning process and social distancing guidelines. Next, we'll go over all of our rapid transit ridership and then at a glance the changes that are being made to those rapid transit lines. As you can see, consistent with many of the other modes, each one of our rapid transit lines has responded differently to a post-COVID world. On average, we're seeing 24% of pre-COVID ridership, but when you look at the blue line at 37% of ridership as a high, and you look at the green line at 20% of ridership as a low, there is variation across our different rapid transit modes. While we're still seeing, again, on average, 24% of ridership from pre-COVID levels, we continue to run 100% or close to 100% of our pre-COVID service. Similar to the other modes, we continue to see extremely low usage of the system after midnight. For rapid transit, the changes that are being proposed are to stop all services after midnight versus 1 a.m. currently. But again, just like the bus network, there'll be no changes to the start of service. We're expecting an average reduction in frequency by 20% across all lines. And similar to the bus network, this may vary on a line-to-line basis based on ridership patterns. Just like the bus network and the commuter rail network, we'll continue to review and adjust these both from a frequency standpoint and a coverage standpoint on a quarterly service planning basis. And last but not least, from a rapid transit standpoint, we are proposing to stop the E-line service at Brigham Circle and divert E-line riders for the remaining 5 stops, which is essentially just under a mile worth of travel to the Route 39. In this case, because we'd be adding additional ridership to the Route 39, we'd be making sure to increase the supply of service to ensure that no crowding or there is not an issue with crowding. For the ferry, we'll also be doing just a quick overview of the proposed changes. First, we plan to stop all ferry service. Initially in this process, the Charlestown-Boston service for ferry was flagged as potentially being an essential service, but due to very low COVID ridership and a highly redundant bus route, which is the 93, we propose to stop that. And so again, in the case of our matrix that we discussed earlier, this would be in the bottom left of the matrix, where again, it's a potentially essential service, but low ridership one. The reason we're also proposing this is we believe that the Route 93 has minimal crowding to date and would be able to support all of the diverted riders. So as we look to how we will want to build back our service, we've put together multiple service packages that are grouped to be able to add back onto our base service to enable your feedback and policy level discussions for how we return back to service. Your feedback during this conversation, as well as others during this public participation process, and our board input will help us prioritize which of these services will come back and help us highlight if we're missing anything. If more funding were to come available in December or at any time during this process, this is how we would prioritize and identify which service packages to add back to our base service. It's critically important that we really understand how you feel about these potential service packages so that we can take that feedback into our planning process. Now I'll go over on a mode basis some of the service packages that we are proposing that could be added back to base service if additional ridership and funds became available. On the rapid transit side, we're proposing to restore the frequency, which would cost about $14 additional million. We are proposing to restore evening service for $3 million and restore the remaining 5 stops on the E-line to Heath Street for $2 million. For commuter rail, we're proposing that we could restore weekend service for a partial of $7 million or in full for $15 million. Or we're considering for $7 million restoring evening service as well. On bus, we're considering restoring frequency for about $7 million on the essential routes and for about $7 million as well for the non-essential bus routes. We're also considering for $3 million restoring evening service on the bus. For ferry, it would cost $1.5 million to restore partial ferry service between Charlestown and Boston, and it would cost $2 million to restore partial service between Hingham, Hull, and Boston. You'll also note on this slide there are 2 additional areas that we could reinvest in service via these service packages. The first is for commuter rail to invest in new connections and service based on our rail vision, which would cost somewhere between $10 to $15 million. And in a similar concept for bus network redesign, it would also allow us to invest in new connections and service for a similar $10 to $15 million. As we are about to switch into the next phase of our conversation tonight, we thought it would be helpful to frame the upcoming feedback that you all are able to give to us. As you think about giving your testimonials and your feedback to us through chat or via call-in, we want you to help think about the following. First, does our framework that we've presented of what essential services looks like make sense? Is this how we should be considering prioritizing service? Second, which of the proposed changes in detail will have the most impact on you based on our adjustments that are being made to these different routes? And third, and just as importantly, how should we be prioritizing adding back service based on the service packages that were just discussed? So with that, I want to thank everyone for letting me walk you through our Forging Ahead process and the proposed service changes that we are discussing here tonight. And I'll hand it back over to Angel to walk us through the Q&A process.
Thank you, Ben, for the presentation. Clarifying questions can be submitted via the Q&A pod. Well, we may not get to all questions. As I mentioned earlier, all comments are part of the official meeting record, will be shared with the MBTA leadership. Next slide, please. To make a comment, you must virtually raise your hand. To do this on the computer, please press Alt-Y or click Raise Hand, the Raise Hand button on the bottom center of your screen. On a mobile device, simply tap the Raise Hand button on the bottom center of your screen. On the phone, you can do this by dialing *9. Once you raise your hand, you will be added to a queue with others who have raised their hands. I will call on a first come, first served basis. When it is your turn to speak, I will say your last name or the last 4 digits of your phone number and let you know that I am unmuting you. If you are on a computer or mobile device, a box will pop up at the center of your screen. You will need to confirm that you like to be unmuted before you begin speaking. If you're on the phone, an automated recording will let you know that you are unmuted. You may speak as soon as the recording finishes. Once you're unmuted, everyone in the meeting can hear you. Before making your comment, please slowly state your name and any organizational affiliation. Please remember to speak slowly, as we have interpreters working with us this evening. We ask that you please limit comments to no more than 2 minutes, and we ask that you only make comments once to ensure that everyone gets a chance to speak. As soon as you are finished, you will be muted again. There are some clarifying questions that I want to put out, but recognizing that my understanding is that some members of the legislature are on roll call, I would like to give them an opportunity to say a few words before we delve completely into some of these. So I'm going to go ahead and do that at the moment. So if you're a member of the legislature and you'd like to speak, I'd ask that you just simply raise your hand, and I'm happy to call on you. Let's see. 1 second. I am going to unmute Emily Granoff from Senator Lewis's office. Emily, I'm asking no one mute you. Hold on, I'm actually having a technical issue here. Hold on 1 second. All right, let's see if we, and this is Senator Lewis, who was asked to say a few words. Senator? Hold on 1 second, I'm having a technical difficulty here.
For everyone, while Angel is sorting that out, obviously I can see that we have a number of participants here, and we also have a number of individuals that are questions that are coming in via the chat. Just know that we are scheduled to stop at 8 p.m., but we will certainly stay on for a bit longer than that to really answer as many questions as we possibly can this evening. So just want to clarify that for folks as Angel's working through this technical issue.
I'm here now, Angel. Thank you. Should I go ahead?
Senator, yeah, we can hear you now.
Thank you. Super. Thank you, Angel. And good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity to provide feedback. I'm State Senator Jason Lewis. On behalf of the 170,000 people that I have the privilege of representing in the communities of Malden, Melrose, Reading, Stoneham, Wakefield, and Winchester, I want to express my deep concern and strong opposition to the Forging Ahead plan. We certainly understand that a big drop in ridership and fare revenue poses significant fiscal challenges for the MBTA, and that you are in an unenviable position. We would be upset, but we would understand if this plan were simply reducing frequency of service on less transit critical routes. But this plan is far more draconian, closing stations, completely eliminating certain services, and shelving critical capital projects. I believe that these proposed cuts go way too far, are in fact premature, and will inflict significant harm on our communities. Many essential workers and businesses in my district continue to rely on bus, subway, and commuter rail service. And I'm particularly concerned about the disproportionate impact that these cuts will have on lower income residents and people of color in my district. And I know you share that concern. Access to reliable public transit is absolutely critical to our local economic development strategy, including transit-oriented development, downtown revitalization efforts, and the production of badly needed housing. In fact, my district has heeded the urging of the Baker administration and enacted major zoning reforms over the last several years to specifically encourage transit-oriented development. These cuts being proposed would put these efforts at risk and would be a huge step backward for us. Furthermore, public transportation is a key part of our strategy to combat climate change, improve air quality and public health, and reduce health disparities that disproportionately impact communities of color. Specifically, in terms of impacts on my district, I want to express my strongest possible opposition to, specifically, closing the Cedar Park Commuter Rail Station, eliminating the 131 and the 136 bus routes, and third, shelving the Winchester Center Station renovation project. In closing, I also question the timing of these proposed cuts. As you know, the state budget process for fiscal year 21 is currently in process, with likely an additional $40 million for the MBTA. The fiscal year 22 budget process will be kicking off shortly and will give us further opportunities to address your budget deficit. And we remain very hopeful that with a new Biden administration, another federal coronavirus relief bill will be forthcoming early next year. And if so, it will very likely include more funding for public transit systems. The timing of when these cuts are going to be implemented is exactly when vaccines are expected to be more widely available and when use of public transportation is likely to start growing quickly again. I urge you to not move forward with this plan, or at the very least, to scale it back significantly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Next, I would like to call on Mayor Paul Broder. Mr. Mayor, I'm going to ask to unmute you.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Outstanding. Right. So, as Mr. Rodriguez said, my name is Paul Broder, and I'm the mayor of the city of Melrose. And I, like Senator Lewis, want to express my strong opposition to the proposed cutbacks to MBTA service. As I understand it, these cuts will impact Melrose in the following ways: elimination of the 131 and 136 buses, elimination of all service at the Cedar Park Commuter Rail Station, elimination of all weekend commuter rail service, and the remaining commuter rail service ending at 9 p.m. Clearly, service in Melrose is taking a substantial and disproportionate hit, no doubt without any relief in the reform of a reduced MBTA assessment. The impact on our commuters, our neighborhoods, and small businesses will be considerable and will slow an economic recovery should a vaccine become available in the next several months, as appears likely. Furthermore, the elimination of 2 bus lines is going to pose particular challenges to our lower income residents, essential workers, and anyone who depends on bus transportation. And regarding the elimination of the Cedar Park stop, it is very difficult to understand how this would save any money. The train will still be running and it will still be staffed, and the station itself is not staffed. The T has tried to eliminate service to the station before, and using this crisis to effect a change that is not going to save money is disappointing. And as Senator Lewis mentioned, the city of Melrose has done an enormous amount of planning work and zoning reform to encourage transit-oriented zoning and as a housing choice community. We believe in and have embraced smart growth policies. The MBTA service cuts threaten that planning and are at odds with the goals of Governor Baker's housing choice legislation. If developers interested in investing in TOD projects in Melrose cannot count on a long-term state commitment to public transportation in the area, they simply will not build these projects. In addition, these cuts will lead to additional car trips as recovery takes hold, creating additional challenges to meeting our goals and the state's goals of becoming net zero by 2050. And we all know that once people stop riding public transportation, it is difficult to get them to start riding again. Thus, these proposed cuts are bad housing policy, bad economic policy, and bad environmental policy. Transit access is in fact the #1 reason people move to Melrose based on resident feedback during our master plan update. Our housing production goals are primarily focused around transit. These cuts will be a huge blow to our efforts and the Commonwealth's objectives, and this plan is a huge step backward. While I recognize the MBTA faces a significant fiscal challenge, these so-called temporary measures create unacceptable obstacles to the economic and environmental future of Melrose and our entire region. In closing, I want to thank the Melrose City Council and the Melrose School Committee, as well as our local realtors, planning board, the Melrose Ped Bike Committee, and local residents who have spoken up to defend our MBTA service. I also want to thank the Melrose Chamber of Commerce, who will be meeting tomorrow about these service cuts. And I want to thank our legislative delegation, Rep. Lipper Garabedian and Senator Lewis, for their advocacy to prevent these cuts. I very much appreciate the time and attention you're giving this matter, but I would strongly urge you to reconsider these cuts and continue to work with our state and federal delegation to find the resources to support these critical transportation services. Thank you again.
Thank you, Mayor. Next, I'm going to unmute State Representative Kate Lipper Garabedian. Representative.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all so much. I don't know if you can see me, but my name is Kate Lipper Garabedian. I am a Melrose resident, a mother, until the pandemic, a daily MBTA rider, and I am also the state representative for the 32nd Middlesex District, which encompasses all of Melrose, roughly half of Wakefield, and the Forestdale neighborhood of Malden. I shared with you at an earlier public hearing regarding the region, including Malden, my deep concerns with the general service reductions proposed system-wide, discussing the costs to our families and individuals, to our regional housing production and economic development initiatives, and to the environment. Tonight, I just want to add some thoughts regarding my opposition to the specific cuts that particularly target my district, the closing of Melrose's Cedar Park Commuter Rail stop and the elimination of 2 bus routes, 131 serving Melrose and 136 serving, among other municipalities, Melrose and Wakefield. And I think the collaborative spirit in which we worked together, I worked together with the delegation for Wakefield, including Senator Lewis and Representative Wong, and of course, Melrose Mayor Paul Broder, the City Council and the School Committee, as well as the Wakefield town leaders. Taken together, Melrose particularly suffers a disproportionate loss of service in this plan. Of the 78 municipalities in the greater Boston area served by the MBTA, basically 10% of the closures and eliminations will occur here. 1 of the 6 station closures and 2 of the 25 bus eliminations. Access to mass transit is critical to our district, for our families, the economy, the environment. I'm deeply concerned, like my colleagues, about the immediate impact that these eliminations will have, especially on lower income residents and essential workers, including the employees at the at the Melrose Wakefield Hospital, our largest employer, which wrote a letter of opposition to this plan, and to many of the nursing homes in the city, where their employees rely on these buses and the commuter rail to reach their places of work. We've also heard that people are using buses to reach the hospital and other medical services that are located nearby. One of the main reasons that the MBTA claims to be closing Cedar Park is due to low ridership. Your report identifies that the number of inbound boardings in 2018 was 98 people, but your most recent Blue Book data indicated an average load number of 223. That Blue Book lists inbound boarding since 2007, and the average over the 7 years of data collected was 276 inbound boardings. So it's unclear to me and to perhaps others about the strength of the recent data that lists in your 98 boardings. So I'd ask you to take a closer look at that. Anecdotally, when I was a city councilor here, I heard from residents who used Cedar Park daily to commute and were often reporting that the lot was almost always full at an early hour, suggesting that this is a well-utilized station. Of course, as well, the 136 and the 131 bus are critical for many people. And the 136 bus serves an entire area of Wakefield that will lose easy access to mass transit if it is completely eliminated. As drafted, the proposal significantly challenges both Melrose and Wakefield's longstanding economic development and housing production efforts, which were taken in good faith and with encouragement from the state administration. So again, I would urge you to reconsider these eliminations, and I stand ready to work with you to come up with more reasonable options. Finally, as I mentioned in the last public comments that I provided, I worry about how long any reductions will remain and the risk that some of these eliminations will be permanent. Your slide deck and your information could be much more robust in the area of how things will come back online or be returned to full service. I'd like to see more objective criteria so that we can all hold ourselves accountable for getting back to normal. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative. I'm going to do a couple clarifying questions before we continue to move on. The first question is that there were several commenters asking about whether these proposals are permanent, especially the closing of the commuter rail stations and the elimination of certain bus routes. Can you clarify whether these changes are permanent and how you will determine when you bring them back if they're closed temporarily?
So I'll take that, Angel. And, you know, essentially one of the points I think that really just, it's worth starting off with again, and it's the same point that we made at my opening remarks, is that we do not want to be reducing service. So I want everyone to really know that and understand that. And as it relates to these changes, each of these changes that we're proposing, particularly in this area, the Cedar Park station, the 131, 136, 351, those are all temporary service changes. These are all things that we know that once we get to a point and ridership has come back in various areas, that we will look to bring back those particular services. Now, when and how we bring back those services, that is a really complicated question. And it's something that we're going to really have a very robust conversation with. I mean, Director Cornegie and I have done several of these meetings now together, and we've heard certainly some common themes throughout each of these meetings. And this question is a question that has come up every single one of the meetings. It is something that is truly dependent on really what the impacts of how we implement and where the implementation comes. And really that comes down to essentially the cost savings come from labor. And if we are laying off, or our contractors are laying off their employees, bringing those employees back on board, retraining, recertifying is obviously a time-consuming process. And then also, if you think about the MBTA, we operate two schedules. So behind the scenes, every single bus route, every single train route, every single metro schedule, so red, orange, green, and blue, each have a schedule. Sheets is what we refer to them internally, that we work off of. So there is also a process that generally in about 3 months in advance of implementation, we have to work out those schedules. So that is a really long-winded answer of saying that it is complicated bringing these services back. And certainly the point has also been well heard across a number of these meetings, even at the beginning of this meeting tonight by some of our earlier elected officials, that the vaccination and the continuing positive news that I think we continue to hear every single day certainly impacts how and when we will begin thinking of bringing things back, and then what we will be doing going forward. So on December 7th, we're going to have the next public conversation with the board, where we will begin really talking through first what we've overwhelmingly have heard through these meetings, and second, really beginning to have that conversation now on what are the changes that we are going to be proposing, and what are the things that we'll be looking to do as it relates to these initial set of proposals, and how they may evolve based upon the feedback that we have heard throughout these last several public meetings, and then all the other public comments that we received through other outlets as well.
Thank you, Jeff. The other question, clarifying question I had here is, if resumption of service can only be implemented every 4 to 6 months, what would be done to alleviate crowding in the interim as riders return?
No, so that's again another good question, and I wish I had an easy answer to say this is what we would do. It's really going to depend on the availability of workforce. What I can tell you is, even earlier today at a senior level, we were having conversations about how we can continue to develop these packages and these service proposals, and part of that evolution of what I was just referring to, of what we'll be presenting on the 7th, to give us the flexibility to still be able to operate service responsibly, really essentially run what we can afford based upon the revenue losses that we're projecting, but also doing it in a way that protects as much essentially manpower, people operating our equipment, running our services every single day, so that we can pivot as quickly as possible to resume those services once we do see that there is crowding.
Thank you. And I'm going to do one more for now, and then we'll go back and forth. What kind of savings are seen from these proposed cuts?
So just to kind of somewhat work it backwards, I think Ben presented tonight that we have a budget gap that's projected to be about 580 million, but just under 600 million. And basically, we talked about a three-pronged approach. The first approach is reallocating some of our capital funds. So a number of our capital funds and capital projects will be essentially slowed down, and that will allow us to take some of those funds to help offset some of the maintenance costs of our system. That makes up for about 380. Ben, if you could, I believe we have a slide too that has that pie chart. Why don't you, if you don't mind, scroll back to that? But somewhere between 380 to about $400 million for that piece. Internally, we're going to be doing a number of departmental programmatic savings. So that's the 90 to 140 million. So essentially $100 million worth of changes to our contracts that we have, professional services contracts, internal staffing changes, such as executive level furloughs, and a number of other initiatives that we're taking internally facing to the organization as a way of tightening our belt. And we're projecting again that would approximately make up about $100 million worth of savings. And then you can see here about the 128 to 142 approximate range of what the service cut impacts are going to be as it relates to each of these individual pieces. In Ben's presentation, he also has the slide that he walked through that talks about the various scenarios of what it would take or what the cost would be to bring back various pieces of what we're proposing. So that can give you a sense of essentially what the individual costs are for each one of these particular proposals.
Thank you. I am going to now ask to unmute Caitlin Long, who's here on behalf of Representative Michael Day. Caitlin?
Hello, everyone. My name is Caitlin Long. I'm from State Representative Day's office. The representative is currently monitoring the roll call. Otherwise, he would be here to strenuously object the plan of pushing the Winchester Center Station back. Our office understands the pressure the MBTA is facing with the need to make decisions and close budgetary gaps reflecting the change in ridership. However, the Winchester Center Station is currently 100% designed, and more than $100 million of development projects are keyed off of this project starting. The entire downtown's economic recovery is going to be harmed by this short-sighted delay. To summarize, Representative Day would like to emphasize that this is a penny wise and millions of dollars foolish. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. Next, I am going to ask to unmute Ms. Lisa Wong, who's the town manager for the town of Winchester. Lisa?
Good evening. Thank you for taking the time to hear from the public. I want to stress my opposition to delaying the $49.9 million renovation of the Winchester train station. Previous delays of this project have more than doubled the cost of this project already, and even a small delay may cost millions more. Delays will negatively affect our small businesses downtown, which are already suffering from the effects of the pandemic, and delays will slow housing growth, which is critical to the economy in Winchester and the greater region. Winchester families and workers move here because of access to public transportation, in particular the Winchester Commuter Rail station. The station is now fueling hundreds of millions of dollars in private investment in Winchester and much needed workforce housing and affordable units for the region. That investment will be put in jeopardy if the station stalls, and Winchester has over 400 units in our development pipeline, most within walking distance of the Winchester Commuter Rail station. One 60-unit development is being built directly adjacent to the train station and is on the same lot that the MBTA needs for easements to complete the renovations. We have worked hard to coordinate this project with the MBTA, and a delay will complicate both projects. The station is also in poor condition, and if safety concerns close the station sooner than anticipated, any delay in the renovation project will mean a longer closure, more public safety issues, higher costs, more traffic, and more emissions as our riders turn to cars as alternative transportation. The Winchester station is at 100% design, it's shovel ready, and until now, it's a fully funded project. Significant work has been put into design, engineering, and coordination with the community, most recently around the timing of the project. Town meeting showed strong support for this project just a few weeks ago by overwhelmingly passing an article to use town funds to supplement parts of this project. Delaying this project has more costs than benefits, and using one-time capital dollars for ongoing operations is an expensive long-term decision. We ask that you move forward and invest in a safe and accessible station in the heart of our town, and we hope you make the right decision and help this project break ground in 2021. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Next, I'm going to call on Ms. Jennifer Grigoritis, who's the president of the Melrose City Council. Council President.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for pronouncing my last name correctly. I appreciate it. My name is Jen Grigoritis, and I'm the president of the Melrose City Council. I'm here tonight on behalf of my 11 council colleagues who unanimously approved a resolution in opposition to the proposed service cuts to our community, which include the elimination of the Cedar Park Commuter Rail Station, the elimination of the 131 and 136 bus lines, and the elimination of weekend and late night commuter rail service. These cuts will have a significant impact on the community of Melrose, and while as a local elected official, I empathize with the budgetary challenges facing public entities right now, we cannot allow these cuts to move forward without an acknowledgement of the very real and negative consequences that they will have on our community, concurrent with the fact that there is no planned reduction in our community's MBTA assessment along with these cuts. We rely on the MBTA to ensure equitable access. In particular, our MEGA students heavily rely on the 131 and 136 buses to ensure connectivity with their classmates and their educational communities beyond the regular transportation provided during the school day. They will lose that access, which I believe creates an inequity. Our small business community has been battered by this pandemic, and they also rely on these bus routes to bring both employees and customers to their restaurants and shops. Furthermore, Melrose is a housing choice community, and we have prioritized the development of transit-oriented housing to assist with alleviating our regional housing crisis, which we all know was a challenge before the pandemic and will likely be further exacerbated in the coming months and years. Melrose has also committed to net zero emissions by 2050, which is only achievable with an increased reliance on public transit. Access to reliable public transit is critical to Melrose's ability to survive this pandemic and to live up to our motto of being one community open for all. I want to thank the members of my local and state delegation for their advocacy on this issue, and thank you all for the opportunity tonight to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Council President. Next, I'm going to unmute Mr. Michael Betancourt, who is the chairman of the Winchester Select Board. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Angel, and everyone here tonight. Appreciate the opportunity to be heard by the MBTA. As you heard from our delegation and Ms. Wong, and I'm certain some other residents, the Winchester Center Station project is critical to housing production for a variety of incomes in the area. We have focused on really changing our narrative in town to smart growth, and we have hundreds of millions of dollars dependent on this project, and I think the only project at 100% design and ready to go. So certainly you've got your work cut out for you looking at some of the data there, but I think the time for capital investment is now, as we look towards the future and what the economy is going to look like on the in the next phase of development over the next few years. So building now in Winchester is going to provide hundreds upon hundreds of units of affordable housing that not only provides access to the greater Boston area, but to the Lowell area further up the line. So our focus over the past several years, and we've been working very closely on the private side, but also especially closely with the MBTA on building a future for the greater Boston area that is focused on transit critical design and affordable housing. And we look forward to that opportunity, and we feel that we're in the right spot to really make improvements that'll benefit the whole region across all income levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next, I'm going to ask to unmute Mr. Bobby Brown. Mr. Brown.
Yes, how's it going? My name is Bobby Brown, and I'm a proud Local 264 bus mechanic. I am also the Secretary Treasurer of the Merrimack Valley Central Labor Council and a resident of Haverhill. During my tenure at the T, I have been no stranger to being an essential employee. Through countless snowstorms and states of emergency, I have always worked alongside my brothers and sisters to keep the city of Boston moving. The year 2020 brought a new meaning to being essential. Through a global pandemic, the essential union workers of the MBTA have answered the call to keep the system running in one of the most trying times in the history of our Commonwealth, our country, and the world. For the past 10 months, we have put our safety and the safety of our families at risk for the sake of keeping the city of Boston moving. We've lost dedicated coworkers to COVID-19. We have members that are still living alone in their garages in an effort to keep their families safe. We come to work because of our dedication to the citizens of the Commonwealth. Public transportation is a necessary tool in combating the spread and aiding the treatment of COVID-19, bringing doctors, nurses, and EMTs to bring life-saving care to their patients. We take pride in being a vital asset to the riding public in the communities we live in. We answered this call after we faced the threat of privatization for 3 years. 3 years of fear and uncertainty of losing our jobs. Without question, we came to keep the system that seemed to consider us expendable running. Some of the members of the board still consider us expendable. With so much uncertainty as we end 2020, I ask the board to please consider the fact that regardless of past treatment, The frontline employees of the MBTA have been and will always be there for the riding public. Without us, the T would not have been able to weather this storm. When considering these plans of fiscal recovery, do not view a single worker as expendable. Layoffs and cuts to service are unacceptable and hurt so many people that are already struggling. We sacrificed our safety for you, and we only ask that we are viewed as what we have proven ourselves to be, essential. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, and certainly I can assure you that these, speaking for myself, but obviously for the leadership of the agency as well, these are not easy conversations, I think, for any of us, but all of us truly recognize the work that you, Local 264, and really all of our brothers and sisters of the other unions that also work to make up the entire MBTA family and the entire MBTA workforce. So really thank you for what you do every day.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Next, I'm going to ask to unmute Ms. Katie Moore. Ms. Moore?
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes,
we can.
Excellent. Thank you all for your time tonight. I'm against these service reductions and eliminations, in particular the 131 bus route. The route for 131 runs within a quarter mile or more of 5,000 parcels in Melrose, Stoneham, Wakefield, and Malden. I don't really have the number of households readily available here, but it's safe to assume a significant number of the parcels have 2 or more households, including those with lower income and people with disabilities. If the 131 and 136 are discontinued, the 137 bus would be the closest public transportation available to the significant portion of the city. Almost 2,500 parcels would be further than a quarter of a mile of that 137 bus line. And of those, a full 2,000 or more on the east side of Melrose are currently within a quarter mile of 131, but are more than a quarter mile from the 137. In fact, some of the area served by 131 is over a mile from the 137 route, and that's just not something that is tenable. Such a change would add more than 40 minutes to someone's commute, or more likely result in a mode shift to a single occupant car. I recognize that ridership is severely decreased due to COVID-related shifts in the work location. However, at this point, it's very likely a short-term issue as more workers are likely to return to the workplaces in mid-2021. Outright elimination of the 131 route is short-sighted when the demand's likely to return roughly in the same time period as the proposed elimination. Rather than a short-term solution, the MBTA should work with the governor, legislature, and transit advocates to address the revenue problem, which is exacerbated but not solely based on COVID-related declines. In addition, significantly reducing service in the interim or potentially consolidating stops could be explored rather than outright elimination. In addition, reevaluation plans should also include processes that gradually increase reduced or lost service. With that, I thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to ask to unmute Mr. Christopher Parker. Hold on, I'm having a bit of a glitch on that. Next, I'm going to call on Mr. Stephen Mao. Mr. Mao?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
we can.
Thank you very much. And I wish to thank the MBTA for this very good presentation. But I do wish to express Wakefield's strong opposition to the proposed cutbacks to the MBTA service. As I understand it, the cuts will impact Wakefield in the following ways: elimination of the 136 bus route, elimination of all weekend commuter rail service, elimination of remaining commuter rail service after 9 p.m. The impact on our commuters, neighborhoods, small businesses will be considerable and will slow an economic recovery should a vaccine become available in the next several months. Furthermore, the elimination of the bus route 136 completely disenfranchises an entire section of Wakefield from public transportation. In fact, recently a low-income housing development was built to specifically take advantage of bus route 136. It is appalling that these citizens who continue to service the public as essential workers will be rewarded with the elimination of critical public transportation should these proposed cuts in service be enacted. And I will say that although ridership has dropped on the 136, according to a presentation from Laura Paget-Seekins this morning, there are still at WCAT Studios in Wakefield, there are still 250 people that ride the 136 daily. I would venture to say that many of them are very essential workers that are taking advantage of this. I was also very intrigued by your presentation tonight, talking about when you are evaluating services, you know, and cutting some, you know, what is the next close available service? You know, 137 runs completely on the other side of Wakefield. So for people in the 136 area, they may be going 2 miles away, okay? 2 miles away to get to a bus service, appalling these people that have been working, continue to work, and some who are elderly, not to mention our students that take advantage of this area. So while I appreciate the need to bridge the budget gap, I question why a draconian measure was taken off the bat. Why aren't we looking at reducing frequency? Senator Lewis said it correct. I don't think any of us would like reductions in frequency, but I think we would accept that in lieu of completely eliminating a line. As far as economic development is concerned, the town of Wakefield has completed an enormous amount of planning work and zoning reform to encourage transit-oriented development. As a community, we have adopted zoning changes to take advantage of smart growth. We have taken to heart the governor's plea to build more market rate and affordable housing. We have currently 326 units under construction in affordable developments right on the commuter rail. The elimination of evening and weekend service will only lead to additional car trips as recovery takes hold, creating additional challenges to meeting our goals of becoming net zero by 2050. Or citizens will simply eschew the extra car trips, will take extra car trips, resulting in less leisure visits to Boston, a fact which will only hurt their business. Entire working class, the lack of night and weekend services will severely restrict the ability to arrive at work and return home, as many lack sufficient resources to utilize private transportation. Anecdotally, Wakefield holds a Wakefield 101 event for new citizens every year, and I will tell you that the vast majority of them talk about public transportation and how wonderful that is in Wakefield, including the bus and commuter rail. So I really think that these cuts are short-sighted and will not help the overall economy. I ask that you look at them, you reconsider this, you take the words of Senator Lewis that you know, there is more money coming down the road, and that we go forward and we forge a path much better together. I want to thank the Wakefield Town Council who all endorsed this letter. I want to thank our state delegation, particularly Senator Lewis, State Representative Lipper Garabedian, and State Representative Wong. And you also received a letter from the Safe Streets Working Group, which is a citizens group in Wakefield that was entered on your portal there to talk how they also feel that these cuts are not advised at this time. But I do thank you for your time. I know it's a tough decision. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to ask to unmute Mr. Matthew Schell. Mr. Schell, I've asked to unmute you.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes,
we can.
So as someone who grew up in the inner city and now who lives in the city of Melrose, my wife and I moved here because of the MBTA. I still don't have a driver's license. So I rely on the MBTA to get to work on a daily basis. And I would love to thank Senator Lewis, Representative Kate, City Councilwoman Jen, and Mayor Paul Brodeur for their excellent words. They took a lot of the words out of my mouth. But it's really, it bothers me that we can cut back service, but eliminating that, I don't know what I'm going to do getting to work on a daily basis. If you cut some of the service, or I will be able to figure out a way how to get to work. Let's put it to you that way. But by cleaning it off the board, it's I don't know, it's not the right thing to do. And are people on the executive board at the TIA, are they taking pay cuts at all? Because I know 2 people on this panel that make between $250,000 and $300,000 a year. So are people taking pay cuts to sacrifice? Because as an MBTA rider, we're sacrificing. Are people on the executive board sacrificing some of their salary? Thank you.
So, I mean, I think certainly, again, there are no easy decisions here. These are difficult conversations. I guess for the record, the control board members are completely voluntary. They are not reimbursed for their time here at the MBTA, and they spend working at the MBTA. And all executives, myself included, are going to be affected by this. We're going to be having conversations about executive furloughs and pay cuts, and myself included are going to be covered by or affected by those proposed changes that will be being discussed at the board.
Thank you, Jeff. Next, I'm going to ask to unmute Mr. Patrick Baxter. Mr. Baxter.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to comment. So I had a couple concerns with the proposed cuts. One, as several have already mentioned, the 131 bus service affects a substantial population that doesn't really have access to other routes. It's significantly far from the 136, 137 route, and it's providing access to the Orange Line station at Oak Grove for a lot of people that either may not have another way to get to the city, or if they do, it's going to be via an automobile, which as traffic starts coming back and everybody starts going back to work, it feels like these cuts are going to go into place right as those changes happen, and everybody wants to get right back on the Orange Line. The other concern is that, of course, if you choose to drive to Oak Grove, those that have done that in the past knew that before COVID-19 happened, the Oak Grove parking lot was typically full by 7:30. So the 131 bus was kind of the way you could get to Oak Grove and get on the Orange Line without having to worry about that parking lot being full during the peak periods. I did have one clarifying question, which is the Cedar Park train station is proposed to be closed. Now, that doesn't directly affect myself, but it's not clear to me how the MBTA is actually saving any money on that. And I was hoping somebody could answer that question, as that's an unstaffed station. There's no parking that's operated by the T at that location. So essentially the only savings you're seeing is, maybe not having somebody shovel out the station after a snowstorm, and, maybe a tiny little bit of fuel on the train from not having to accelerate out of the station. Thank you.
So certainly as it relates to the clarifying question, and this question has come up a lot in a lot of the other regions as well, where we're proposing station closures there. In some cases, it is the moves of the trains themselves. For instance, the Plymouth station, we essentially have to back a train down to get to the Plymouth station, board all of our customers, and then leave the station in a forward position. So there is a scheduling impact of several minutes that is saved by that particular piece. For these other stations, the maintenance of the station, including snow shoveling, you're absolutely right. I mean, that certainly is one of the pieces of the savings. But really, when you think of it over system-wide, it's just adding up with the starting and stopping of the trains for each of these stations. So it is the runtime for each of these individual stations. And it's important to note, too, that this is a proposed change. Certainly, I will say that the closure of some of these commuter rail stations is something that we have heard a lot, both in the meetings and as well as feedback that we've received from our online forums. So certainly something we'll have a continued discussion on. But to answer your question, really, particularly as it relates to Cedar Park, it is on essentially the runtime and not having to start and stop the trains coming in and out of those stations. And then obviously with that, knowing the proximity and number of parking spaces that are available at the next closest station, which I believe in this case is Wyoming Hills, to the Wyoming Hills to Cedar Park, correct?
Thank you. Next, I am going to unmute Mr. George Proakis. I apologize if I mispronounced your name.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. My name is George Proakis. I am a 16-year resident of Melrose, 20-year sort of working in the world of city planning in the public sector. I speak as a resident of Melrose tonight, but I just want to start by saying I appreciate and realize the challenge that you all have working as MBTA employees trying to move forward a service cut at a point in time when so many of us want to be talking to you about increasing service and providing more transit and all of the great things that the T provides to our region. I know this is challenging, and I know that we are only here because we're dealing with a funding and a revenue challenge that puts us in this position in this particular time. I want to make 5 quick points and dig a little bit deeper into one, and I'll try to do it as quickly as possible. First of all, I am really hoping, and I don't know, I've spoken directly to the folks in our legislative delegation. I don't know if they're still on the call, but I do hope that there's an opportunity for the T, the MassDOT Secretary, the House, and the Senate to get on the same page about some ways to start to address the revenue process here, to slow this process and provide more options to have more service remain. I know that requires a lot of people to get on the same page, and I hope it can happen soon, because I do think that's one of the ways to address this challenge. Second of all, I hope the T, as you look at these cuts, takes an opportunity to consider the full cost of all the options, including the impact on the economy, on employment, on unemployment in the city. As our union employee said tonight, within our region, if we end up in a situation where we lay off a number of T employees, there's ripple effects on the economy. It may save the T money. It may cost the state money in the long run, and we need to balance all those things out and understand them, because the layoffs may actually have more impacts than not doing the layoffs under those circumstances. I hope you continue to consider the potential loss of transit-oriented development when addressing impact on services. I think a number of people addressed that tonight. There are a lot of decisions about transit stations and lines that are made where we're making long-term housing decisions, and those housing decisions become a challenge if the transit service isn't there or if the transit service is less reliable. I hope you can find a way at some point to commit to a minimum level of service on all lines, all modes, and all stations. As Senator Lewis said, if we can get to a point where we're reducing service but not cutting things, we understand the challenges there, but the cuts to the bus routes, to the commuter rail stations, those things are the things that hurt the most. But I want to take one moment again to focus on Cedar Park Station in Melrose. And again, while I don't think closing commuter rail stations is something that I would ever be that supportive of, I want to single out Cedar Park and compare it a moment to the others on the closure list. It has substantially more people using it. The walk shed around the station is completely different than the other stations proposed for closure. While most of the others are park and ride lots, Cedar Park generates a significant portion of people who walk to the station. In fact, the Melrose neighborhood was built around this station and around the access to the railroad. And a number of those riders, particularly ones who live just north of Cedar Park Station, will be far enough away from the Highland Station or the Wyoming Station that they would have to get into their car to go to another station. And once they get into their car, they're much more likely to drive their whole trip to work than continue to be commuter rail riders. Essentially, it operates much more like an urban station than some of the other stations that are being closed, much more like a trolley station than a commuter rail station in many ways. And again, while I appreciate the challenges the other communities have, consider that Melrose has twice the population density of Beverly, 5 times the density of Walpole, and more than 8 times the population density of Weston and Plymouth, where other cuts are being considered for commuter rail stations. So I do think there's a circumstance where closing this station is one thing that really deserves a deeper reconsideration as you look at the overall set of cuts. And that's it for tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George.
Hello? Am I being heard?
Go ahead, Matthew. We can hear you.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Matthew Wong. I am a current student at LaSalle University in Newton, Massachusetts, with my residence during the academic off-season in Salem, New Hampshire. And I am deeply concerned with the proposal to eliminate weekend commuter rail service. Because as one side effect of the pandemic is that it is not very easy for parents to come onto a college campus and pick up their students. There is a whole process that has to be followed, and it's often a drawn out process where you have to go through a whole bunch of hoops just to get authorization for a parent to come onto the campus because they're considered a guest. And there's pretty much a no guests policy with a few exceptions. So therefore, the commuter rail on the weekend is my ticket to get home for a weekend, or for either for a long weekend or just for a weekend to come home. And without weekend commuter rail service, then I'll pretty much be stuck. And now I would like to, and I've been following along with this process. My suggestion would be, and I don't know whether it's well oriented or not, but my suggestion would be to consider, instead of completely eliminating service, consider eliminating or reducing redundant service, or for specifically in relation to the Merrimack Valley region. I do not see the purpose of needing a separate commuter rail stations for Haverhill and Bradford. Those stations are literally a half mile apart, separated by only the river, in which case there is a vehicular and pedestrian bridge that parallels the railroad bridge. And so it just seems quite redundant to be stopping the trains at both Haverhill and Bradford. My suggestion would be to either temporarily close or at least reduce service at Bradford and have all trains going to Haverhill, with the choice of Haverhill being that because of the Downeaster connection there, that should be the choice of station to keep open out of those two. And also the southern portion of the Haverhill line is completely redundant to the Orange line as well. So I'd question whether or not we need to have full capacity on both the commuter rail and the Orange line between Malden Center and North Station, because that just seems to be redundant as well. So I don't know whether it would save any resources to perhaps to look at those cases where you have multiple modes serving the same purpose, and to consider eliminating or reducing one of those modes that is redundant to another one, and perhaps only bringing back the second mode during rush hour or during other peak periods. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you. Next, I am going to unmute Mr. Jonathan Chines.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Great. My name is Jonathan Chines. I'm a member of the Wakefield Town Council and appreciate the opportunity to speak tonight. Joining Wakefield Town Administrator Steve Mayo, Senator Jason Lewis, and Representative Kate Lipper-Garabedian to express my deep opposition to the service cuts proposed tonight as part of the Forging Ahead plan. As Administrator Mayo, Senator Lewis, and Representative Lipper-Garabedian have discussed, I'm particularly concerned about the proposals to eliminate the 136 bus route and to significantly reduce night and weekend service on the commuter rail. If enacted, these cuts will cause disproportionate harm to Wakefield's most vulnerable residents and will compromise the future economic viability of our community and our region. Access to public transportation is a lifeline for many residents in Wakefield, particularly lower income individuals and individuals with disabilities. Many of these residents, many of whom I've heard from in the last few weeks, rely on bus and train service to access jobs and medical care, often already enduring long waits and erratic service from the MBTA. Eliminating bus service and off-peak commuter rail service would have a crushing impact on the ability of these individuals who rely on public transit to maintain their livelihood and their ability to engage in the community. It's especially concerning to me that the elimination of the 136 bus route would leave roughly half of our town without any access to public transportation and no viable alternatives given the distance to the 137 bus route. In addition to harming vulnerable residents in Wakefield, the MBTA's proposed cuts would threaten the future economic growth of our community as a whole. As Town Administrator Mayo mentioned, Wakefield has invested heavily in promoting transit-oriented development, both as a strategy for affordable housing production and as an opportunity to attract commercial investment in our town. A lack of reliable, accessible, and affordable public transit options will compromise this strategy, eroding our tax base and hindering our ability to provide needed services to our residents. To the extent that reduced service from the MBTA increases vehicle traffic in Wakefield, we also will face long-term costs in terms of increased congestion, greater risk of harm to pedestrians, and declining air quality. I understand and appreciate the challenges that the MBTA faces as a result of the pandemic, and as a local leader, I know that the challenges of maintaining services in such unprecedented times are difficult. However, we must recognize that the MBTA cannot cut its way out of this problem. Residents in Wakefield and across the region only will return to public transportation if service is convenient, accessible, and timely. Cuts to bus and commuter rail services will drive additional riders away, further hindering the MBTA's ability to restore or even maintain current service in the future. I urge the MBTA in the strongest possible terms to reconsider the draconian cuts that have been proposed and instead look at reductions in services rather than eliminations. I also ask that you work with the Commonwealth's congressional delegation and our state legislative leaders to find the funding support needed to keep these vital transportation lifelines open to everyone across our region. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, I'd like to remind folks to the extent possible that we keep to the time limit so we can hear from as many folks as possible. Next, I'm going to unmute Mr. Brian Capola. Mr. Capola. Mr. Capola.
Hello, I'm here. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. I'm here because I'm legally blind and hard of hearing, and I depend on public transportation a lot. Okay, yes, I understand that this is a pandemic and that you are going through some challenging times right now. But as you've heard, you've heard a lot on the news, if you're watching the news, there's been encouraging news about the vaccines. Well, I'm not here to talk about the vaccines right now. What I want to talk about is cut these services would be detrimental to me. It would put me in a more restrictive environment than in a least restrictive environment, especially up in the Merrimack Valley where I live. I rely a lot on the commuter rail to get in from Haverhill or Methuen to Boston. So therefore, to reduce services would not be a good idea. To cut weekend services would be a bad idea. It would not be doable. It would make a car a necessity to me, of which I don't drive. So I am asking you to work with with the legislators and get them some funding to keep the commuter rail running in Haverhill. Thank you, and the bus is running as much as possible. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Paul.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to unmute Mr. Adam Serafin. Mr. Serafin, I've asked to unmute you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. I'm in strong opposition to the proposed transit service cuts in Melrose outlined in Forging Ahead, especially the elimination of the Cedar Park commuter rail station. The proposal is regressive and runs counter to the transportation goals for the Commonwealth. The city of Melrose was largely developed in the 19th century around access to the railway. It is literally central to Melrose in our history. Transit access is one of the core amenities that make this an attractive and vibrant community. There's an entire business district at Cedar Park that arose to meet the needs of transit riders and thrives to this day. Additionally, our city has zoned properties within walking distance of the Cedar Park station to allow for high-density housing to provide citizens access to transit and reduce reliance on automobiles. This is consistent with the goals for transit-oriented development for the Commonwealth, and this proposal would remove that transit access. On a personal note, I have ridden the commuter rail from Cedar Park into Boston for the past 8 years. It is fast, clean, and efficient. I live within walking distance of the station, and as a result, my family of 4 only owns 1 automobile. Closing the station would present a hardship to my family, as walking to the nearest stop at Wyoming Hill would add 25 minutes a day to my commute. Cedar Park Station has been in operation for 175 years, since 1845. It has been in operation through a civil war, another massive global pandemic in 1918, 2 world wars, rise of the automobile and the decline of public transit in the post-war period, and the urban renaissance and increased transit ridership for the past few decades. We will emerge from the current crisis and continue to ride the rails for generations to come. Please do not make a short-sighted decision that would close this station. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to ask to unmute Mr. Christopher Park. Mr. Park.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Thank you for taking my my call.
I actually did have a planned statement, written statement to read out loud, but I think a lot of my fellow community, including my elected officials, Mayor Paul Brodeur, Kate, State Rep Kate Lippert-Garabedian, and our City Councilwoman has done a great job in listing and outlining the issues I have regarding the elimination of Cedar Park. I did want to make a quick few points about some of the slides that were presented today. I noticed that, you know, Wyoming Hill is listed as 0.6 miles away with 30 parking spots. That seems like a short distance, but as a gentleman who preceded me said, it's going to add at least 20 minutes commuting in terms of walking, which if you have two young ones is logistically really, really difficult to accommodate, which forces us to find or seek alternative transportation modes. For me, it would be buying an additional car, at which that point, you know, that means we might as well just drive to Boston, and that's a sunk cost. There's no point in going back to riding the commuter rail, which we want to do. And, you know, I'm not really happy with the way the ridership response was evaluated or will be evaluated. In that particular slide, I saw that there was no evaluation in terms of bringing back the Cedar Station. There were phased approaches about bringing back ridership to the weekends, which is obviously also important. But I fear that once we take this away from Melrose, that will be a permanent solution. And finally, I contest the numbers about the ridership on the Cedar Park. As a personal rider, along with my wife, we go at different times. I know that there are at least 20, 25 people when I get on. I know it's very similar, if not more, when my wife gets on. And I just ask you to revisit those numbers, because certainly I think there's a lot more people who are riding and counting on that stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher.
Next, I'm going to ask Mr. Ryan Williams. Mr. Williams, you've been unmuted.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm one of the officers of the Volunteer Melrose Ped Bike Committee, and I'm a Melrose resident and a transit user pre-pandemic. First, I want to say that I completely understand and I respect the need to protect communities of color and of less privilege in trying to figure out how to balance the MBTA's budget, and I think everyone in these communities understands that. One of the things that I'm concerned about in listening to this presentation is what I perceive as an auto-focused approach to transit access. As the last two commenters mentioned, we keep hearing a lot about how there are nearby stations that are only 2 or 3 miles away. And the next talking point is that they have 30 or 40 spaces available for cars. In a community like Melrose, certainly the group that I'm a part of and many others, including the mayor, including the legislative delegation, we have worked very, very hard to try and make Melrose a more walkable and bikeable city. We've directly engaged with the T around Oak Grove Station, and we've just put a tremendous amount of work into trying to allow people to live in this town without having to drive anywhere. 2 miles is not a walkable solution, and if you're advocating for more people to drive to the T, they're not going to drive to a station with 30 spots at 8 o'clock in the morning to risk not getting to work on time. They're going to drive to Wellington. And so you're actually talking about adding 8 or 10 miles of round trip driving per person through our community, maybe 100 or 200 or 300 additional car trips a day, and we just can't absorb that. We're trying to discourage access to cars. We're trying to do lots of transit-oriented development and planning, and we would really love the T's participation and support in these efforts. And finally, I just want to say that there is a bit of a trust gap between the T and the communities that it serves. You're talking to Orange Line riders who have waded through endless delays, trains that have caught on fire in the stations with no way out. And we really need to see some more specificity around when the reductions will be resumed and what kind of processes will be used to restore service, particularly around lines that have been permanently closed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, I'm going to mute Ms. Denise Murray. Ms. Murray.
Thank you. I just want to say that I'm kind of disappointed. I was, prior to the pandemic, a daily rider, both in the morning and in the late afternoon, early evening of the 136. I'm not sure if anyone else is riding the 136 that's on this call, but I know that that bus was so crowded. I'm so glad that you're going to have people now who are looking at the crowding, because that bus was so crowded that we would have people standing up. You couldn't even get into the bus in the evenings. I'm not sure, as ridership comes back, what's going to happen with the 136 being returned to service. What would make more sense to me as an alternative to just eliminating the 136 would be to have the bus drivers drive the 137 route one way, the 136 route back into Boston, and then out of Boston, the 136 route, and back into Boston, the 137 route. That's going to reduce the route by half, but at least you'll still have access to the entire town of Wakefield. I just want to say thank you to all of our representatives, because they have expressed how disappointed we are. I started taking the T only maybe 4 or 5 years ago, taking the bus, and it's become a tremendous source of transportation for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, I'm going to ask to mute Finn McSweeney.
Thank you.
I'm going to come back to Mr. McSweeney.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Sorry about that. I think that I have 2 comments. The first is on the elimination of the 131 and the 136. From a practical perspective, something I haven't heard talked about tonight is that those 2 bus lines permit people to ride the orange line into Oak Grove and then access Melrose, access downtown Melrose, City Hall, the hospital, as people have mentioned. It's a substantially more affordable way of accessing Melrose than going to the commuter rail, the most proximate commuter rail stations. People who are accustomed to accessing, say, the hospital or downtown Melrose via the buses, frequently they won't be able to afford taking the commuter rail instead. It costs hundreds of dollars more per month to, say, go to Wyoming Hill or go to the Highlands and then walk to your destination than it does to go to Oak Grove and then take the bus. So there's a huge affordability problem and a use case problem for people who do that right now as their last mile solution. The other comment I want to make, as Mr. Gonaville said, these conversations are going to continue. I'd appreciate a little bit more of a MassDOT overlay. We heard about other transit authorities who are making cuts. That's not really relevant to us. We could just as easily talk about cities like Austin who are making massive investments, right? What would be relevant to us is a MassDOT conversation about our roadways. Is roadway spending in wealthier communities going down? Is state police spending in wealthier communities going down? This is a budgetary conversation, and when we're talking about it at that level, I think we should compare it to other modes of transportation rather than just starting from the perspective that this is only a transit matter, because it's not. It's much bigger than that. And if we're talking about spending, I think we should do a more comprehensive MassDOT overlay. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to unmute Miss Maggie Abdow.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I want to begin, I'm a Melrose resident of 18 years, and during that entirety, I have been a daily transit rider pre-pandemic, primarily using the 131, 136, and the Orange Line. I want to thank Jason Lewis, Kate Lieber-Gardian, Paul Broder, and Jen Grigoratis about their comments, because they echoed all of my concerns, and as have my neighbors who have spoken before me. I want to specifically point out that I want to urge the MBTA to not eliminate the 131, 136 bus or the Cedar Park commuter rail, but specifically I want to talk about the 131, 136. I want to echo other callers about I'm not sure where the numbers came from for ridership. As a daily rider for 18 years, the buses have been consistently overcrowded, especially during rush hour. I also want to point out that I've raised a family of 4 and 2 children, middle and high school age, who have grown up and been raised to navigate the public transit and rely on it to get across Melrose to school, as many school and young people do. And also, I want to echo the caller before me, the neighbor before me, about the costs and how many people rely on the 131, 136 to access the Orange Line due to prohibitive costs surrounding the commuter rail stations. And that, again, to emphasize that riding into using, we made a housing choice for Melrose in order to access transit. Working, both my spouse and I, working in the city, commuting daily into the city. It also should be noted that if you are to drive into the city, you also have the obstacle of handling very high parking fees, which can be an obstruction if you're, especially if you're working for a non-for-profit organization or community organization. And again, I just want to thank my elected officials and appreciate the time that is being afforded for our community to be able to speak about this.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to ask to unmute Mr. Bill Bernardino. Mr. Bernardino.
How you doing, Angel?
Good. How are
you?
Good
evening, Jeff. Good, thanks. I got 2 questions just for Mr. Gonville. Right now, you want to cut the routes in service that will be putting more passengers on crowded buses, trolleys, and trains. You're putting the passengers in danger. What is the maximum limit of passengers on a 40-foot bus right now under the CDC and governor's guidelines? The second question would be, we hear saving money by trying to save money by checking the website, MBTA website. There is almost $6 million in upper management job postings. There'll be upper management cuts and layoffs. Will there be upper management cuts and layoffs? You're taking it out on the workers and the passengers when management should be reduced. And will there an executive furlough? Will that be offered to the operating personnel also? And is there a hiring freeze? And the third one is, the MBTA is a transportation business, not in the management business. It doesn't make sense to eliminate any portion of transportation. Remember, a public transit is a public good. Thank you.
All right, Bill. So I'm going to try to remember your answer. And for everyone that is here, Bill Bernardino is the vice president of the Boston Carmen's Union, Local 589, which is our local region. Bill and I know each other very well and have worked together for a number of years. So to answer your question, I'll try to somewhat take them in order. I think geez, I'm totally blanking on your first question. I knew the answer to it when you asked it, but okay. The first question was on the crowding standards. So there is no established crowding standards for transit buses. What we have established, and the board has worked through, but what we've established is we're monitoring our customer loads on every bus. For a 40-foot bus, we are viewing more than 20 passengers as being crowded. And if you go to our website, and we have a tracking tool now that is available so that you could put in your route and see the buses along that route and be able to see where they are with that crowding standard that we've established. We are not limiting service or access to the buses if we exceed that number. So it is not a hard number. And Bill, as you know, though, we do have a practice where if the operator is at a point where our operator's area is being crowded to the point where customers are advancing in advance of the an area that we've designated on the buses, the operators then call into dispatch and notify our dispatchers that that bus is at capacity, it is logged, and then that operator is given direction to proceed from the next stops. And Bill, listen, the reductions to the workforce are not an easy conversation. And as it relates to the executives and the executives portion of this, I think we saw earlier in tonight's presentation, we talked through these service changes proposals are about $140 million worth of savings broadly across all modes, ferry, commuter rail, rapid transit, streetcars, so Mattapan and Green Line, but then also with the bus services. But another piece of that is looking internally, including executive staffs, for another $100 million worth of savings. So yes, to answer your question as it relates to what the impact is going to be for the executives, there will be an executive furlough that we're going to be talking through with the board. No decision has been finalized anywhere, whether it relates to service cuts, whether it relates to what the impacts of that will be to the workforce, or also to what will be done internally. As it relates to postings that you continue to see happening, including bus operators and other key operating positions that we are filling right now, we are still running a service. We have a responsibility to maintain our system. We have the responsibility to safely operate our system. So there are key positions that we're continuing to move forward and fill when we have these key vacancies in these various areas. And that's our responsibility and obligation, because we do have to have people here to safely operate the system. And then lastly, I completely, Angel, do you remember what I'm sorry, what Bill's last question was? Or Ben, I'm drawing a blank with the last piece of that.
I gotta be honest, I forgot that last piece too, Jeff. I apologize.
Okay, so as it relates to go ahead, Ben. Did you have it?
Yeah, it was a question of would the furloughs be offered to non-executive staff, but I think yeah.
That's right. Yep, thank you. And Bill, we are working very closely right now, and I know you're working with I've had conversations with Jim Evers, the president of Local 589, but I know Ahmad is also working closely with you and your team to talk through various alternatives. So there are a number of things that are being looked at and being proposed, and I think laying off staff is the last that we would want to do. And certainly we'll be looking closely with you and partnering with yourself and the rest of the executive board and the Local 589 and really all of our other union partners as well, to thinking of other creative alternatives that we can come up with that will still result in a savings for the authority, but also protecting jobs.
Thank you, Jeff. We have a couple more here. We have 3 more. Next, I'm going to ask Mr. Seamus Kelly to unmute. Mr. Kelly?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I just wanted to speak in opposition to the Cedar Park closure. As numerous people have said, our neighborhood really developed around it. People have moved to our neighborhood because you can walk to the station, shifting us to think that we're going to walk to Wyoming Hill or to the Highlands, where we're going to add 20 minutes to our walk in the morning, which is 20 minutes less with our children, et cetera. Just doesn't seem like it's something that's going to happen. I think it's going to cause people to drive, most likely drive to other stations, try to find, maybe even go into as far as Wellington just to be able to get a parking space. Last thing I want to do is try to get to Wyoming Hill and then not have parking and then figure out what my next steps are to get to work on time. I also think we're not really seeing the data that would suggest why Cedar Park should be closed versus other stations around the state. I think it's been noted that it's significantly higher ridership than the other stations are getting closed. There was some talk about labor being a driver of things. There isn't a significant amount of labor at that station. There's also some talk about how Plymouth required some logistical challenges for the trains. Our station really doesn't. It's the start stop. It's no different than any other inbound station on that line. So I think it's a bad idea. It's not something that is good for the people who live in Melrose, who purchase their homes here, who want to be able to walk to the train. And so those are my general comments. I'd echo all my neighbors and like to thank our legislative delegation, the mayor, and the city council. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to ask to unmute Ms. Lauren Wilkins. Ms. Wilkins.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to add to the opposition to closing the Cedar Park and thank my neighbors and legislators for being on the call. I've been a rider for the past 6 years. I live in the Cedar Park neighborhood. I can in fact watch during this meeting, watch the Cedar Park train, or rather watch the train go back and forth near my house. In the neighborhood, most of us that do take the train, in fact, only have one car. So in fact, that will affect the way we live our lives day to day now. And then for some of us are working from home post-COVID. I'd also like to add, there is a school bus stop at the corner of Tremont and West Emerson. And that is for the public charter school. That is actually the bus stop I use for my children, and others do as well. So on a typical day, during non-COVID times, of course, we would send our children on the school bus and turn around and 10 minutes later take the train into Boston. So that is just another consideration out there. And one more question. On that slide where you had the reopening or adding back of service, it wasn't clear to me that that would happen with Cedar Park. Is that something that will be considered as time goes on if this station is closed?
Yes. I think we've acknowledged, even going through these presentations with other regions, that we don't have or didn't have particular stations listed there. You know, I can say this. Look, I think tonight we've overly have heard about Cedar Park Station, and certainly I can say in many of the other regions we also heard about those stations as well. So I think everyone tonight has raised some very valid points and made some very compelling arguments, and certainly we will be bringing that back to the board and passing along the feedback that we've received.
Thank you. I'm going to next ask to unmute Mr. David Sidnowski, and then after that we have one more. Oh, looks like I'm asking to unmute you now.
Yes. Hi. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. My name is David Zipkowski, and I'm a resident of Wakefield. And I have some serious concerns about the proposed cuts of the Route 136 and the commuter rail service in Wakefield. Not only do essential workers rely on this service, but so do people with disabilities. And I work and help people with disabilities find jobs. And one of the biggest barriers that my clients run into is transportation issues, and being able to get to and from work, as well as getting to essential doctor's appointments, such as therapy appointments, seeing their psychiatrist, seeing their medical doctors. A lot of the doctors are in Boston because of mass health reasons. Not all doctors take them, but the big hospitals in Boston tend to take their mass health. And I believe that cutting service will make it very difficult for people with disabilities to get around. And I have a couple clarifying questions in regards to the Cedar Park closure. You had stated that the closure of the station has partly to do with the fuel that is used for the trains to accelerate out of the station. Do you have data that shows how much the MBTA spends on fuel for this one station? Because I think that would be important for people to see if that's one of the reasons. And then also in regards to the closure of the Plymouth station, you had mentioned that part of the reason for the closure is because you have to back a train into the station. Does it really make sense to cut off a whole town from the commuter rail because you have to back a train into a station? And then you also stated that the Kingston station is a little over 2 miles away. That does not do any good if someone does not have a vehicle to get to Kingston. Are they going to walk 2 miles to get to Kingston to get to commuter rail? It just does not make sense. I think the MBTA should look at other ways of saving money other than taking it out on their riders, rely on this transportation to get to essential appointments as well as work. I'm very disappointed that the MBTA would even consider cutting services at this time, and when people are already dealing with a pandemic and they're having issues with losing jobs and not having their money. So I would hope that you would reconsider this, and I just want to thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Angel, I think I'll quickly respond to that. So first off, the fuel consumption for the station, that's not actually what I said. I think that there was, and I apologize if it was misunderstood. I think there was a particular commenter had said that, but essentially it's the starting and stopping and the amount of time that takes broadly when you start thinking about all the closures across the station, across the system, and looking at what that equates to for crew times and crew schedules, and that obviously there is a labor savings that comes along with not needing as many train crews because of calculated, savings across the entire system, which then also moves into the Plymouth station. I will say this, on the closing of the commuter rail stations and really broadly across all of the changes that we're proposing, particularly the areas where we are looking to eliminate service, these are not easy conversations. And there is no real good answer here, but what we can say is the areas that we were looking to protect and preserve have the strongest ridership and the most transit dependent communities that are relying on them. So there are no easy answers here. And again, there was a filter, a lens that our teams went through when they came up with these various proposals. But again, there is no easy solution to our financial issue.
Thank you. And last, I'm gonna, our folks who have raised their hands tonight is Mr. Andrew Reeld. I'm gonna ask to unmute you.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I just want to thank everyone for their time tonight. I'm a resident of Melrose as well. My wife and I moved here due to the proximity to plenty of different MBTA services. Yeah, I just want to thank you all for the forum, and there's been some great points made tonight. One thing that I have not heard mentioned is the, I believe, proposed consolidation of the 132 bus. We live very close to this bus route, and prior to COVID, my wife used it every day to get to work, and I walked down to the commuter rail at Wyoming Hill. But I haven't really heard any details about what the proposed consolidation of the 132 would be, and especially if there's already talk of eliminating the 136 and the 131, could that then put additional strain on the 132, or what would the future be for the 132 in this new environment of proposed service cuts and service discontinuances at for these other bus routes? And I also want to reiterate too that the closure of Cedar Park does seem significantly short-sighted, given that ridership will likely start increasing hopefully within the next 6 months to a year. But yeah, primarily the 132 is what I was looking for a little more clarification on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. And the 132, we are proposing to make some adjustments to the schedule. At this time, we are not proposing to combine that with any other route, but essentially there would be some scheduling changes that would happen to the Route 132, but they have not been, the details of that have not been completely worked out yet. But essentially the frequency, or basically the amount of time between each bus is going to increase on the Route 132.
Thank you. So folks, that is, those are all the raised hands that we had today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to now welcome Deputy General Manager Gonneville to make some closing remarks. Again, you can reach us and provide us more feedback at public engagement at mbta.com, or you can go to mbta.com/forging ahead. We are taking public comments through December 4th at 5 p.m. And again, Thank you for joining us. And now I'll turn it over to you, Deputy General Manager, to close us off. Thank you.
So thank you, Angel. I just want to see, Director Cornegay, did you want to say a few remarks before we close the evening? I don't know if you're still with us this evening. I see you. Director, how are you?
Thank you, Deputy General Manager. I did want to first thank everybody for taking the time to inform us tonight. This is such a sort of not just a tricky subject, but it's also emotional. And I want to say that we really are listening and learning a lot of things about how people actually are using the T. I mean, we knew a lot of stuff, but that's what the meeting's for, to get some sense of that. Want to particularly say that this is an extraordinarily difficult time, but it's, but we're dealing with an extraordinarily difficult circumstance, and do understand how difficult it is to the idea of taking something away and what that means in terms of understanding how to put things back. I want to reiterate what the Deputy General Manager said. It's like we're thinking of all the resources available to us to get us through this what we see as a very temporary challenge. And we understand that there are shifting realities happening all around us. But I will say, I, for one, feel really strongly that it is part of my job to be able to address some of the things that we see coming ahead of us, despite some of these options that may or may not materialize. Another thing I want to stress that, again, the Deputy General Manager said is, there's particular lead time items to some of these things. And so we're having to figure out some things now in which by the time they get into action, they may not, the circumstances may be different, but we have to start on a path now if we're going to be able to do anything about it in the future. I do want to thank the staff. Like this is extraordinarily, like I said, difficult for them. They go to work every day wanting, to provide this very public service to the citizens of the Commonwealth. And none of them want to be in this conversation and in this position. And I think that they are, really listening, but really trying to create an environment where people get to put forth their ideas, and they really, find this a very difficult conversation. So I, again, on behalf of the board, want to thank them and thank you all. And I can't reiterate enough that we really are listening, and it may not be that, everything that everybody says happens, but we really are being informed by this process, and appreciate how much it affects you all in terms of our ridership and in terms of our employees, and how we think about this moving forward. So that's all I got, Jeff.
Thank you, Director. So I'll just quickly add to the Director's comments. We are collecting feedback until Friday at 5 o'clock. What I would encourage each of you to go, I know you've heard through Ben's presentation, it's up on the slide right now, where to go to give further comment. Just go to the MBTA's website. On the MBTA's website, you'll see there's 3 major headings. One of them is Forging Ahead. If you click on that, you'll get a listing of all the various service proposals that are being talked through, not just for this region, but broadly across the entire MBTA system. But on there is provide your feedback. If you click on that button, that will allow you and link right to this. You can submit your comments in writing. Everyone who testified tonight, all of this has been recorded and will be part of the formal record. Following Friday, our teams are already beginning to compile people's responses, but your comments tonight, as well as everyone's comments that is submitted up until, again, 5 o'clock on Friday, will be compiled and then submitted over to the board for their review, and ultimately our discussion on Monday's board meeting. But thank you everyone again for the time this evening. And I'll turn it back to you, Angel.
Thank you. Again, you can see here on the screen, you can reach us through mbta.com/forgingahead, or you can reach our community liaisons at publicengagement.com through this upcoming Friday. Thank you for joining us tonight, and we hope you guys all stay safe. Thank you.